So there you go. There's a drilling rig in the Bakken in North Dakota. Kirsten Stasio, who you've already heard from in class, took this picture on a field trip that was related to wind power development, actually, out in North Dakota. But since she's been part of this class, she took advantage of being out there to capture this picture and give a sense. You see the flare there in the underneath the date today. So these are the kind of questions that we want to ask. Certainly, environment is front and center. Understanding and contextualizing where drilling takes place in the world. And we've already talked about the fact we're the largest consumer and largest producer of oil and gas in the world. So it makes sense that a lot of the action around drilling and the environmental impacts are in the United States. Not completely, but the good news is today we have really rigorous regulation. Staffing it, like everything else, is not always what we'd like it to be. And we're going to dig in and look at the offshore environment. So, and this is talking to kind of contextualize, who are the players? Because there's different roles. So some of you have heard of companies like Halliburton and Schlumberger. When I was growing up in the industry, we called those service companies, oil field service companies. So they really focus on the completion side of things. There are companies that just specialize in the drilling, so that BP or Exxon might hire to be their drilling contractors. And Nabors and Liberty are two examples of those kinds of companies. So it's just segmenting the market a little bit, and then giving you a sense of globally who are the biggest global producers, in this case of oil, and ranking them and giving them a sense of things. I spend a lot of time in Oklahoma City, and there's a company called Chesapeake that doesn't even make the list here that is a big producer largely of natural gas. But this gives you a sense of some of the names, hopefully, that you recognize and who's relevant and important. Also on this slide, we wanted to give you a sense of how many feet are drilled per well in the lower right. And it shows you that horizontal well bores or directional well bores have much longer length to them. And a lot of that length is horizontal. Most horizontal wells start out drilling vertically, like 5,000 to 8,000 feet. And then I still can't understand, honestly, how the steel drill stem bends in the subsurface. But computers and physicists and engineers figure out, and they have special motors on the drill bit that cause it to be able to be steered, and sensors associated with that. So we get these increasingly long laterals, is what we call them. There's the vertical part of the well, and then the lateral part is the horizontal part. So giving you a sense of that trend over time, and also giving you a sense for what percentage in the United States of wells are horizontal or vertical. So we're going to keep punching through a lot of kind of contextual information. This is showing you the role of offshore versus onshore, both globally, number of oil and gas. So in the upper left, we're looking at rigs, which is different than wells. So this is where is the drilling going on, is basically what this is addressing, and showing you that most of the drilling is in North America, and most of it is onshore, a little bit of offshore. And second would be the Middle East. Worldwide, showing you on the bottom where the production is. It's over 70% is onshore, about a third is offshore, and the North Sea and the US are high, in the ranking of where is the offshore activity going on. And then in the US, seeing the role of onshore and offshore there in the pie chart on the lower right. And then who's got the wells. And this data is about almost 10 years out of date. It's hard to get good data from around the world. But I don't think it's changed a lot. And you see that the US, with our unusual situation, who's going to remind me what I shared with you on Monday is, why do we have more wells than anybody else? What are some reasons? That is the number one reason, is private mineral rights. Anybody have any idea of another reason? We're going to cover it later in the lecture, but I just want to see if someone can guess. Yes, orphaned wells. So that really leads to this idea. We're going to get to something that I used to joke about in class, and sometimes we put it on a test. We have a regulatory statute, it's a federal statute, that basically says we're going to subsidize what are called stripper wells. And stripper wells have a very low volume of production. These are wells that normally would be abandoned, but there is a special tax break for these low volume wells because the federal government believes it's better to subsidize these low volume wells than it is to go send aircraft carriers and jets off to the Middle East to protect access to oil. So we've got a slide in a little bit that will show that we have Our average production per well in the United States is the lowest of any country in the world, and part of it is because of that subsidy structure. So we're going to talk about drilling now. This is Kemp Gregory, who actually leads Renewwell that I was talking about before. He worked for Shell. He's up in Alberta. And it reminded me, I spent 3 winters on the Blackfeet and Crow Indian reservations managing drilling operations. And I literally had a spacesuit that I wish someone, I call it a spacesuit. I wish I had a picture of myself, because it felt like I was just in some big, I could barely move in it. It was both for safety and because it was like 30 degrees below zero. It was super, super cold. So the environment of a lot of drilling activity, at least historically, has been in some pretty rugged environments. One of the things that's important for everybody to realize is hydraulic fracturing, which we're going to talk about, has a nickname called fracking, which the coal industry put on hydraulic fracturing because it sounded a little bit like another F word. So it doesn't mean that hydraulic fracturing is perfect or great or anything, but from a technical point of view, what we've been doing actually, and Halliburton pioneered back in the late 1940s, is hydraulic fracturing, which is creating an artificial fracture system that from what occurs naturally and creating permeability. Remember we talked about conventional reservoirs or unconventional reservoirs. So when this is about the geometries of wells, and it's not about hydraulic fracturing, but I just wanted, this has time here on it. And we first started hydraulic fracturing back in the late 40s. We married, and we did it in vertical wells. But a big breakthrough happened in the 1990s, early 1990s, and I was in the gas industry at the time, and I actually knew the head earth scientist for Mitchell Energy, and he called me and he said, "We've done it." And it was a really exciting time because they drilled their first horizontal well and combined it with hydraulic fracturing like we showed you in the Shell video. So that's how old, this is about a 30-year-old phenomena of horizontal drilling when they first did it. It was like the beta. It took a while for it to take off, and you see that over half the rigs were going horizontal by 2008. And if you look at 2017 and beyond, we've been operating in a world where 80 to 90% of all drilling is horizontal, mainly because it has much less impact at the surface for the amount of drilling you need to do. Because in a vertical well, if you have a layer of rock and it's 100 feet thick, in a vertical well, you only drill through 100 feet of it. But in a horizontal well, you can drill through a mile of it, because that's a very common length of a lateral, is about a mile long. And so you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that the amount of the reservoir you can reach is much more in a horizontal well, and so you need radically fewer wells. If you look back here, where I was showing, well, see how many fewer wells we're drilling in 2020, 2022 than we were back in 2010? And that's because horizontal wells are so much more productive that you need way fewer wells. So one of the first areas we pioneered the directional drilling was in urban places like Los Angeles, where there literally are buildings that at first you think they're an office building, but they're actually a building that is cloaking a drilling rig that has directionally drilled wells under the city of Los Angeles. The other place where we pioneered directional drilling was in offshore platforms, where we didn't at first go down vertically and go horizontal. And what's allowed us to go horizontal is computing power and the ability to steer the bit and to have sensors and controls and manage things. The whole process of a directional well or a horizontal well, the pathway of that drill bit is highly regulated. You have to permit the path of the well, and if you go off permit, you have to stop drilling and go through the regulatory alignment, because part of it has to do with the mineral rights, and part of it has to do with just the management of the whole process. So it's very carefully monitored, not just at the surface, but in the subsurface. What's the pathway that well is going to take? So our main goal is that you understand these 3 different geometries of wells and how things have evolved over time. Drilling rigs haven't changed too much in terms of the fundamental systems. A new idea is actually putting the electrical and this top drive system is kind of an evolving technology that's here just kind of for people who want to geek out on it, but I really don't need you. You're not accountable to know about it. But in the notes of this slide, it explains and reminds you what the fundamental systems of a drilling rig are, and the fact that how big do you think a drilling rig is for a reservoir that's at 5,000 feet versus a reservoir that's at 15,000 feet? Do you think the drilling rig would change size depending on how deep you have to go? So the answer is yes, because you need a bigger, the drill pipe is super heavy. And you need a bigger structure, just structural engineering wise, to support. The deeper you're going, the bigger the rig you need, basically, to support all the weight that you're managing of all the drill pipe you're pulling up. So I'm going to start the process. You see it's highlighted the drill bit. This tri-cone bit, the design of this was pioneered by Howard Hughes, who some people refer to as the Elon Musk of his day. Howard Hughes was into aerospace, medicine, the film industry, many, many things. But he is responsible for a lot of patents and designs around things in the oil and Baker Hughes, some of you have heard of as an oil and gas service company. That's all tied to Howard Hughes. So everybody, I've never had anyone get injured as we pass this around class, so let's not have it be today. But the idea, as Justine's, is that the drill pipe screws into this bit, and the drill pipe is hollow, and the drilling mud is going at very high flow rates down the drill bit and helping keep the bit cool and lubricating the bit and helping move the cuttings up to the surface. And so that tri-cone bit gets very, very hot because it's grinding through rock. And when you think of the economics of drilling, and this could be for geothermal, it could be for oil, it could be for gas, it could be drilling wells for water disposal or for carbon capture. You want to make whole. Is kind of you want to drill as quickly as you can without any kind of structural or mechanical failure. And so drill bits are really important. When I was out in the field, 30 plus years ago, people, if you were drilling, you would buy the bits, and then when the bits became ineffective because the rock layers change and you didn't have the right bit type, and you have to pull the bit out of the wellbore, and that's called tripping the bit, screw on a new bit, and go all the way back down with it. The technology of drill bits, do we have any material science people in the class? Oh, we love you, because figuring out how to super design what are on the teeth of that drill bit you're holding and to grind through the rock faster and better has really improved. And at any drill site, there will be a pile over, very carefully arranged, of probably like 20 different bits over on the side, because as you drill to different depths, you need different kinds of drill bits to go through. The business model of drill bits has changed where you lease the bit rather than owning it if you're a company drilling. And you basically pay for the amount of time that bit, the odometer time that is down there and how worn it is. So that's changed in the last 30 years. I'm sorry, that's a little bit of an esoteric idea. There's electrical systems, there's mechanical systems, there's water systems. Those are all important aspects of a drill bit, of a drilling rig, and there's good coverage of that. I'm going to just start passing some of these around too. We're going to end up talking about proppant. Proppant is, you saw it in the video, the shell video. If we hydraulically fracture a rock and we don't stick something in those little fractures to keep them open, they will close back. And so proppant is like tiny sand grains that get injected with a hydraulic fracturing fluid. And there's actually natural sand that's a very specific design that gets used, but there's a lot of synthetic sand, essentially, or proppant. And so petroleum engineers pick the size and characteristics of the proppant, and so these come in a little catalog. I'm passing them around so you get a sense of what is in the hydraulic fracture fluid and helps hold the fractures open so the hydrocarbons can continue to flow. So there's a little bit more. There's the bit on Howard Hughes. There's a fair bit about him in the notes. And this is just highlighting that there's different kinds of bits. I'm not holding you accountable to know a lot about drill bits. It's mainly just to recognize that if you want to drill for geothermal, if you're working for Fervo, or if you're working for Chesapeake or Devon, and for Nate, who's from Oklahoma, so Mitchell Energy is based in Texas. It got acquired by Devon, that's in Oklahoma City. So along with Chesapeake, Devon and Chesapeake are the two big operators based in Oklahoma. There you go. What's class without a really cute little animation showing you the circulatory system? And again, there on this slide, for your benefit, there are a lot of notes about this that are really just there to help you, not that we're going to be testing you on. But the thing that is relevant about drilling mud, it was a big wake-up call to me as a petroleum geologist when I went out to well sites, and there was a mud engineer and a mud logger, and I was like, what's this mud stuff? And drilling mud is basically water with a very specially designed clays in it that help accomplish all the things you see here. So we want the fluid, which looks kind of like chocolate milk, but much thinner, actually. We want the drilling mud to be able to carry the cuttings up to the surface as the drill bit is working its way through, because the more efficient. So here's the drill pipe. The drill bit is at the end of it. The fluid's coming down the middle, the inside of that pipe, and then it's pushing, and the bit's grinding away, and then the drilling fluid comes back up outside the drill pipe, circulates back up, and you want the density of that fluid to be such that it will carry the cuttings up without things getting clogged in the hole that you're drilling. So that's part of how the mud's designed, and getting the weight of the mud's important, and the drilling mud helps prevent the hole that you're drilling from collapsing in on the drill pipe. So keeps everything stable and cleans and cools the bit. So this is a really important piece of equipment that we didn't always have historically, called a blowout preventer. And blowout preventers are essential. Every wellhead in the United States that's a modern, active, recent, drilled in the last 30 or 40 years has blowout preventers. It usually has at least 3. A few of them are shown. There's blind rams, there's shear rams. So it's all part of this Christmas tree stack, if you will, that you have to have those in place as you're drilling to prevent. We have blowout preventers to manage the fact that, as we talked about on Monday, we really don't know what we're getting into in the subsurface. We don't know what to expect. We try and gather as much information as we can, but sometimes you drill into a zone that has unexpected levels of pressure, subsurface pressure. And when that happens, you can lose control of the well. And so the blowout preventers are there to prevent a blowout, just like it sounds. So, sadly, 99.9% of the time, these usually three different layers of blowout preventers prevent anything from happening. But there was, in 2010, we'll talk more about it, the Deepwater Horizon spill, BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico was an example, because we have blowout preventers in the offshore environment too. And the reason for that spill is the blowout preventers failed. And it resulted in a very, very large spill. A very low frequency, but high impact event took place with the blowout preventer being at the root of it. Just going back in geothermal, which you're going to have a dedicated lecture to, and we'll refer back to oil and gas when we do it, there are blowout preventers when you drill geothermal wells as well, because of some of the same risks. This is just showing 3 different flavors of blowout preventers. You're not held accountable for them. I'm not going to get into them because you're not held accountable for them. It's more to make the point that there's a lot of regulation around blowout preventers and how big and strong they need to be. For every oil and gas company that's going to drill has to make the case and show a lot of research of what they think they're going to encounter, and then they size the blowout preventers. They boost the capacity of the blowout preventers above what the oil and gas company thinks they might encounter. This kind of riffs off of what the video showed, which is to drill any new oil and gas well today, you have to have telescoping casing. So usually the very first opening of a well that you're about to drill at the surface has a very big opening to it, because gradually the casing is going to get smaller. And it shows the different levels of casing here. And then ultimately, once you're at significant depth, usually several thousand feet down through any potable water, then you get into your main casing of the wellbore. But this telescoping casing is a very important part of the protection of aquifers in the shallower range. So showing a mile depth, everybody knows roughly what a mile is. So the average depth of oil and gas production is somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 8,000 feet. It's not uncommon for it to be about a mile depth. And this is showing the Marcellus Shale, which is dominantly being developed in the state of Pennsylvania. So the casing set, but there's a lot of cementing, and there's a whole lot of testing and essentially radiology we can do of the casing and the cement, and testing the cement to make sure that cement has really good integrity. We're going to talk about completing now a little bit. So our main issue, going back to, our main issue here is with wells that are older than 40 years old, where we didn't do this telescoping casing the way we do today. So this picture is important to highlight the idea, the difference between drilling and completing. When I was growing up in the business, they kind of all felt like the same thing, but they've really become segregated now with horizontal drilling and large-scale hydraulic fracturing. And drilling the well tends to be about a third of the cost, and completing the well, which is the perforations and the hydraulic fracturing and bringing the well online, that tends to be about 2/3 of the cost of the well. So, and there's something called a DUC, which is a DUC, it's in the notes for this slide, which is a drilled, let's see if I get it right, it's drilled but not completed. Let's see, even drilled uncompleted well is a DUC. That doesn't make sense because you'd think that would be a drilled uncompleted W. But a DUC is one of the things the industry looks at. Is if you kind of think of inventory management and just-in-time management of a supply chain, the industry changed from how it had been for a long time, about 10 years ago, and they realized that they could drill the wells, but wait to complete them until the price of gas or oil was attractive. And they could come in, bring in the drilling equipment, drill everything, and wait for a certain amount of time, and then do the completions. And so the inventory of DUCs out there is something that oil and gas price analysts look at, because that's production that can get brought on pretty quickly, because as the video showed, completing the well, even though it's 2/3 of the cost, it's a much shorter time frame than it is to drill the well. This is just an elaboration of what you saw in the video. Is there's perforating guns that basically set off charges that once you've set casing in the well, these charges punch through the casing and create the openings through which the hydraulic fracturing can take place and where the hydrocarbons can flow into the wellbore. And in the notes, there's a little video that elaborates more on perforations. So this is where proppant comes up, which I think has made its way largely around the classroom now. And there's an example of it, or the prompt to share it with you in the lower right. This is from the new, actually got shown in the New York Times, even though other sources are shown here, elaborating and kind of showing a different version of what the video did of what's going on at the surface, what the geometry of the well is. You see the telescoping casing at the top, and you see the horizontal leg, the lateral of the well, and the hydraulic fracturing. So that's really, my goal is just to show you many different ways, basically the same thing, and we're actually going to talk about it even more on Friday. So I think I touched on the fact that the first place where this was applied horizontally was in something called the Barnett Shale in Texas, and Mitchell Energy, who was later acquired by Devon, were the people who first pioneered this. And again, it opened up what we view as the hydrocarbon source rocks for natural gas, these shales, and it turned the source of the gas into the reservoir for the gas if you drilled horizontally through them and hydraulically fracked them. So this is what we call a Christmas tree, and this is what's left. In the Shell video, it showed these. So when you moved all the equipment, you put a big stack of valves. So this is basically a cartoon picture and then a real picture of what a Christmas tree looks like, depending, again, the smaller the well, the smaller the Christmas tree, the deeper the well, and the bigger the flow, the bigger the Christmas tree you'll have. So some of the valves are there to manage production and to keep things under control. This is post-drilling, post-completion, and this is a situation where there is natural flow. And if you went to the geysers, which is the biggest geothermal field in the world, you would see many Christmas trees like this as well. In the 20 years ago, these were manually controlled. Today, they're completely automated in terms of controlling flow rates. And if you went to Sanardo oil field, which you'll see some pictures of, or any oil field in California, most of those wellheads have pump jacks on them. They're going up and down, and they're lifting oil out of the ground. So in the absence, if things are flowing naturally, which does not happen in all cases, you would just see Christmas trees like this. So that's part of the end game of oil and gas production, is seeing assemblies like this on the surface. So this is a reminder that oil occurs in rocks that pretty much look like bricks. It's like, how could we possibly get hydrocarbons out of this? And this is why hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing has been so effective. We're going to talk a little bit about production. And, so this is a good one. So it's just a reminder. I get asked very frequently, so if we produce oil, out of a reservoir, why isn't there subsidence? And it's because in most cases the reservoir rock is very rigid. We're only getting 10 to 30%, if we're lucky, of the oil that's there out of place. It's very unusual to get more than 30% recovery. So that's why we don't have very much subsidence. There are a few fields where there is, but it's very much the exception rather than the rule. So I'm taking you back to the two Ps, porosity and permeability. It's a really important part of the story of how production works. And so why do we only get a quarter to a third of the available oil in the rocks out? These are the 5 reasons. So capillary forces, which for those of you that ever do dishes, you haven't thought about capillary forces before. If you have something really good sauce with a lot of oil in it, to overcome the capillary forces, you need heat, you need hot water, and you need soap. And soap is basically a surfactant in the land of getting oil out of a reservoir. So those capillary forces and that high surface tension means that these big fat oil molecules don't unstick from the reservoir very easily. The oil tends to be pretty viscous. The reservoir is heterogeneous. The density of the fluids you inject to try and push more oil or gas out, largely oil, tend to be low density. So these are all the reasons that we have low recoveries. At San Ardo oil field, where I wish we were going this quarter, and hopefully we'll go in the spring, the oil is almost the consistency of peanut butter. It does not flow, or at least really heavy molasses. And so that's another, that's when I say it's thick, it's in a lot of cases oil just does not flow very well. So this is highlighting the steps in oil recovery. So it's much more focused on oil here. The primary recovery, when you drill and you find oil, what comes up naturally really is primary recovery. And it tends to be in the range of 10 to 15% of the oil in place. And it's just natural flow or artificial lift, which is a pump jack, which we have some elaboration on in our notes. Secondary recovery, a really good example of that is Prudhoe Bay up in Alaska, where there's oil with associated gas. There's no market for the gas, so they re-inject the gas in the field, and it enhances the oil recovery. So that would be a good example of secondary recovery, injecting water that's wastewater. It would be in no way be potable water, but there are some situations where the produced water just gets re-injected, and that helps maintain reservoir pressure, and that's secondary recovery. And then something that is really the area where we've learned the most so far. It's changing rapidly because we're thinking about carbon capture and storage, utilization and storage differently now than we were up until now, but kind of the pioneering area of carbon capture, utilization, and storage was enhanced oil recovery. And one of the most common ways that we enhance the recovery of oil above 20% or so, certainly in Texas is the primary areas we inject CO2 in, and it helps push some of the oil out that otherwise would not move. In California, we use thermal recovery. We inject steam in the reservoir to push more oil out. And in some cases, surfactants, which is basically like soap, get injected into the reservoir just the way you were doing, if you were doing dishes, it breaks the surface tension and moves some of the oil out. So this is an elaboration on primary recovery. Nice to know, not super required, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's just making the argument that sometimes it's water pushing the primary recovery, sometimes it's gas. It just depends on the circumstances. If you're a petroleum engineer and trying to understand an oil or oil and gas field, understanding this mechanism helps you plan for the life of the field. This is showing you a pump jack and how it works and how it lifts oil up out of the well. So this is a wonderful animation that you can spend a little bit more time with. It's not a good use of our collective time together to dig into it right now, but certainly in heavy oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, pump jacks are a kind of part of the landscape, things going up and down like this. They're usually the pumps are run off electricity, so that becomes part of the embodied energy of getting the oil up and out of the ground. But people are always curious about how these work, and the notes on this slide give a lot more information than I'm going to spend time on right now. This is an elaboration on gas injection or secondary recovery, again, Prudhoe Bay being a famous example. And this is meant to contextualize, and we wish the data globally was more current. This is the best we've been able to find. But it shows you worldwide that enhanced EOR and tertiary recovery are the same thing. And 2% of global production, so that's pretty small, is coming from EOR. And within that, CO2 injection is number one. A lot of that in the Permian Basin in Texas, famously most stewarded by Occidental Petroleum, which is Warren Buffett's, one of his favorite companies. And there's a very impressive woman who leads Occidental, and they most recently, just in the last few weeks, if we were doing energy in the news, they just bought Carbon Engineering, which is a very visible direct air capture, or DAC, company. And they're capturing CO2 in the air, using it and injecting it to get higher recoveries from the oil fields. And they are playing out a pathway that we're, as a society, trying to figure out, which is, can they produce net zero oil because they've captured enough carbon to offset what happens when you burn the oil that they produce. Still trying to get figured out and get everybody comfortable with it. And we have a few slides on that in a moment. One of the challenges of getting higher recoveries is that oil is actually really inexpensive. So it's about $90 a barrel right now. What have we got up there? 88. That's about the price of oil today, actually. And so you look at what can you inject a barrel of into an oil field to get more oil out. And we're kind of being playful here about the Veuve Clicquot and the Tabasco sauce and the Budweiser and things like that. But it's to make the point that for a company who owns an oil field, it's actually really tricky to find something that will displace oil and get higher recoveries out of the reservoir. So, and the price of oil moves up and down a lot, so that affects the certainty of how much you invest in those things. So in California, 55%, over half of the oil production, comes from steam injection. In this field that I have pictures of in a moment, and we usually take students to, but couldn't this time, they would not be recovering oil at all out of the ground if they weren't injecting heat into it. So here it comes in the form of steam. They make the steam. It turns out in San Ardo, they have 2 very large combined cycle gas turbine power plants. They generate electricity on the surface. They take the waste heat to make steam. They inject it in the ground, and it enhances the production of the oil. So that's a look at what San Ardo oil field looks like. That's about 2.5 hours south of here that we often go to. This is an old field. It was developed in the 40s and the 50s for the most part. Because the oil is so dense and thick, the wells have to be really close together because it can't flow very far. And there are a lot of pump jacks. So, this is not a recipe for people looking and saying, wow, that's cool. There's barely any impact on the surface. There's a lot of impact on the surface. But it's 1 billion barrels of oil, and it's here versus somewhere else. So until we figure out how to move our transportation to EVs and transport less and more bicycles and things like that, this is a legacy asset, and it's really interesting to see. Only 6% of what comes out of any producing well is oil. All the rest is ancient water. So for those of you interested in water, it's basically, for civil engineers, it's a big water treatment plant, basically. And there's, folks, 6% oil. For the class, this is just another view of what gas injection oil recovery looks like, and this is what Occidental and a handful of other companies are doing, largely in the Permian Basin. A key thing that's happened when I first started going to San Ardo 40 years ago, but I'm only 39, when I started going 40 years ago, there were thousands of people that worked on that oil field. Today, there's like a few hundred. And like so many other things in life, it's been automated a lot, and they have really taken environmental stewardship seriously and safety more seriously than they had in the past. And a key point to make for anybody in any oil and gas field or geothermal field, anything in the subsurface, the degree of our ability to measure and monitor on a continuous basis is very high compared to what it was 10 years ago. So, and a lot of that goes on. And then a workover rig kind of feels to me a little bit metaphorically like saying, you remodel your house, you have good plumbing, but sometimes things don't work out, you call Roto-Rooter. So workover rigs come in and work over existing well bores and clean them up. There can be debris that's in the well that affects its production levels, and that differs a great deal based on the nature of the reservoir. So at San Ardo, there are a lot of workover rigs that come in and basically clean up and remediate existing wells. An important part of the story, when you think about production and completion, and why DUCs are relevant, is that if you look at the upper graph, in the first 4 years, look how steeply your production declines. So if you have 4 BCF of gas, you're much more interested in bringing that well online when it's $4 an MCF than you are when it's $2 an MCF. So that's the nature. What happens when you hydraulically fracture a well? You get a lot of gas at once because all that gas has been trapped, in that impermeable rock. and then it declines on a very hyperbolic decline. So timing when you bring production on, unless you really have a long-term view or you have a hedging strategy for your production, they all go into that. So at the top is showing you what it looks like for an individual oil or gas well in most cases that's been horizontally drilled and hydraulically fractured. The lower graph is interesting to me because that's showing, and we haven't been able to get an updated version of it, but it still signals the idea, which is each color band is a vintage of production that was added in a certain year. So if you think of the United States, how much gas did we add? And so there's total production is the top of the curve. But each vintage is on decline. So if you want to maintain production, you have to keep drilling to replace the decline that's been going on in the prior years. And so that's the way, and that affects your thinking. Remember we learned about reserve to production ratio? So you have to this is another dimension of thinking about how much drilling do we need to do to replace the decline that's going on the wells we already have. That is if you're having the view that your goal is to maintain production. Your goal could be, let's create subsidies and incentives to wean us off this and to use other sources of energy. But it's just to help get you to think about the fact when you drill a well, it's not linear. The point of this slide is once you drill, and once you produce, and once you monitor, and you do all those things, what happens to what leaves the wellbore? And so depending on where we are, we have streams over on the left-hand side. We have water, we have oil. Condensate is another word for natural gas liquids, basically. And then we have natural gas that the way it's drawn here, it says it's sour, which means it could be rich in sulfur. It might be sweet gas, which is not rich in sulfur. But in any case, the point, without you getting into all the details of this, is what I care about is that you understand that at a production site, there's processing that happens. There's big tanks and things that are designed to separate and purify different streams of NGLs, natural gas liquids, oil and gas and water, and make sure they all either go to market or get disposed of properly. And this is meant to highlight some of those steps and give you a sense of that complexity. This happens very near the well site. Refining oil, we tend to take the oil that's the second flow there, the dehydration, the sweetening, and the stabilization, and says go to refinery. So we can ship that crude oil once we've cleaned it up and we've separated it from the water and done some things to it. Then it goes to a refinery, and Diana's going to talk about that, where it gets turned into 20 or 30 different things, number one of which is gasoline. So then we're going to talk about the rig count and how it's changed and efficiency gains. So this is how many drilling rigs are operating at any time. And I know you are all people who love having as many apps as possible on your phone. So if that's true, which it may not be, but in any case, downloading, which we've encouraged you to do, the Baker Hughes app, and it allows you on your phone to keep track of where is drilling going on and where are the permits, what's going on in the whole world, offshore, onshore, et cetera. And then you won't have to look at that very small print that's over on the right-hand side. But it does show you that the United States has more rigs going than any other country in the world in the pie chart. And Baker Hughes app, which you can do on your computer or on your phone, helps bring it alive and make it real for you. This is just showing the path of how many oil wells and natural gas wells that are how many rigs, not wells, are operating at any given time in the US. The price of gas is pretty low right now. The price of oil is pretty high, so that's why we've seen the rig count for oil pop up a bit. But it's nowhere near what it was 10 years ago, when you can see that there was many more rigs operating than there are today. So this is a picture that is pretty poor rendering of what the video was showing you, but it's meant to make the point that actually before horizontal drilling, much the way I made the analogy that before angioplasty, my dad had to have open heart surgery just to get plaque out of a valve in his heart. That was a big deal. Now, if my dad were still around, they would just, do horizontal drilling through a vein in his leg up to his heart, do a little directional drill bit, clean out the plaque, pull it back out, and be done. It's much less invasive. So we have one pad for 16 wells now, and very high recoveries out of horizontal drilling, whereas traditional vertical wells meant we had to have all these holes in all these pads and have them, it looked more like San Ardo. So we would never create a San Ardo today, given our ability to drill horizontally. So that's a legacy field. So the argument I like to put in front of people is, in a world where yes, we would prefer everything was non-fossil. But as long as we are using natural gas to help enable renewables, because it backs up renewables, and as long as we're using oil until we get the EV supply chain figured out, it's better to be doing horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing from my point of view. That doesn't mean it needs to be your point of view, than it is to be doing it the vertical, the open heart surgery way we were doing it in the past. So this is just this reminder of this progression of vertical, how recently this has all happened. And zipper fracking is Kemp Gregory, the gentleman who there was a picture of earlier. He added this graphic, and this zipper fracking is this idea of having multiple wells near each other, simultaneously fracturing all of them, and that's just a nickname from the completion world. And noting that we went horizontal first for gas in 2008 on a pretty significant scale, and it was only 4 or 5 years later that we opened up tight oil resources like the Bakken and North Dakota, which nobody imagined we would do that before 2000. So it's just to give a sense of timing. Oh, there's those zipper fracks. So I like to use this because I'm going to give you a wind lecture in a month or so. And, you know, I was around, you guys. I was in Stanford Business School in 1985 when cell phones looked like that. So we called them cell phones then. They did not text. They just did one thing, and they cost $5,000, okay? So we still call, you know, that was a cell phone. Where is my cell phone? Here's my cell phone. We call this a cell phone. So we call it the same thing, but it's really different. And so the reason I make that point is a well from 1930 is really, or 1960 is really different than a well today. That does, but we have this legacy issue. Those phones are not a big legacy issue. The old oil and gas wells are a legacy or poop issue. So, and I'm going to show you in the wind lecture what wind turbines looked like in 1983, and they were super hokey compared to the, you know, amazing wind turbines that we use today. But we still call them wind turbines, and we count them, but they're very different things technically. So this is highlighting for you in the United States, and for those of you that are from around the world and you care a lot less about the United States, I apologize for the US bias. But if you had to say where are the 5 most important places for oil and the 5 most important places for gas in the United States, this is what they are. So we've made the list, and we've highlighted it on the map. It's a little hard to read the map, and I apologize for that. But we're going to look at it a little bit more, and this is showing you US gas production and the role of the shale gas. So the non-shale gas production's in gray, and the shale gas reservoirs are the ones in color. And they're color-coded first for Appalachia, which is Marcellus and Utica, the dry gas, meaning no oil to speak of, Haynesville, Barnett, and Fayetteville. And then the associated gas plays are in largely in the Permian, but the Eagle Ford, which is largely in Texas, and the Bakken and North Dakota are those plays. And just showing you how they've grown. And that's gas. So this is another way of looking at the 3 regions that account for most of the gas production. We're still on gas. So we're going to look at it. I'm going to go back. Here we go. So that's looking at it with really pretty colors and breaking it out into more detail. If you look at it here, the Haynesville is in Texas and Louisiana. The Permian is in Texas and New Mexico. And Appalachia is really the prime states for production there are Pennsylvania and West Virginia. So then there's the rest of the United States. So you kind of get a sense of, well, where's our gas coming from? That's the goal, and how it's grown, and why the US, we were importing natural gas. We were building LNG facilities to import LNG from other countries, and we actually repurposed those facilities so that we could export LNG because of the shale gas revolution. So now we've got oil. This is tight oil production. It says it opened up the resource, but this is not the resource. This is the production, and it's showing you the importance of the Bakken, which is the kind of brick color second down. The first couple on top, the Wolfcamp and Sprayberry, those are in the Permian Basin. So you see the role, how significant it's been since 2010 in terms of our horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. So that whole phenomena is like 13 years old. And we were a pretty significant importer of oil in 2010, and now we're an exporter of oil. That's happened in 13 years. So from a national security point of view, that's a big deal. From dealing with greenhouse gases and pricing carbon, that's not what this is about, and we all know that's a super important issue. So this is giving you a sense of where does oil come from in the United States. Texas is way ahead of everybody else, federal offshore. And then you see the rise of North Dakota and New Mexico. With New Mexico, that's largely the Permian Basin. So the role of tight oil is really significant. If you go, that pie chart is a different way of looking at that. And it didn't used to be that way, as you can see. So what does this cause, this transformation? So we got a bunch of challenges, actually. As I mentioned, we're venting a lot of natural gas to the atmosphere or flaring it. That we don't have anything, we haven't figured out how to create markets for it, and the regulators haven't clamped down on that the way they could, so it's putting a lot of methane in the atmosphere. It's great we have this tight oil, but that's something I'm most worried about out of all of this, actually. That we didn't have the pipeline infrastructure to move the oil, say, from North Dakota, so we put it on rail cars, and there were some spills associated with that. And the pipeline infrastructure that they want to build is disruptive, and it's hard to get, it's triggering banana issues. Remember, bananas build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So it's great we found this oil, but we can't move it to the market. So that's been hard, and understandable protests about that. And I mentioned the satellite view of the flares in North Dakota. There's a company called Crusoe that some of you may have followed that has said, okay, there's this gas that nobody has a market for. We're going to set up right at the wellhead, practically, and we're going to take that gas that's basically free, and we're going to use it for Bitcoin, so to mine Bitcoin. So use it for something useful. So Crusoe is an interesting company to read about if you've never heard about it before. It's important to think about what are the biggest issues: water use, water contamination, seismicity. My favorite, in terms of what's most important, is methane leakage and flaring. Noise, traffic. One of the things communities care a lot about is the truck traffic, because the trucks that bring all the hydraulic fracturing fluid and sand and things in. So it's very high impact, honestly, on a community for a short period of time. So it's very common for communities to say, okay, we'll give you the social license to operate, but you've got to pave a bunch of roads for us when you're done. Or you've got to drill some water wells. They negotiate. You've got to build a school. So that's true of any resource development, but we've seen a lot of that happen with the shale gas and tight oil revolution. So it is highly regulated, but you can have all the regulations in the world. If they don't get reinforced or enforced, that's an issue. And noise, this idea of the social license to operate, whatever you're doing in the energy system, you have to have community support. And so companies have learned that if they blow it in one community, it follows them to the next one. And so they're better stewards today than you would imagine. And we still have the legacy issues. So here's my number about, look at the average production of US wells, 12 barrels per day. So we have some wells that are very high producers. We just have so many stripper wells, which are described on the right in a picture of them there, compared to Saudi Arabia, which has very few wells and beautiful reservoir quality, most of which is very conventional with very high porosity. So imagine in your paleogeology, imagine beautiful big sand dunes. Most of us have at least seen pictures of sand dunes with very high porosity. That's the kind of reservoirs they have in the Middle East. Not everywhere, but enough of them. So it's not all wells are the same. So understanding the water side of things and the difference between produced water and flowback water. So hydraulic fracturing creates flowback water, and it tends to be a very small percentage of the water that we have to manage when we're doing horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. The main water source that we need to manage is the water that's been trapped down there with the gas or the oil that comes back up. And that is where we've run into interesting challenges. So at the bottom of this slide, it says we have 38,000 EPA approved. They're called Class 2 wells for water disposal. And most Americans don't know, these have been around for a long time. Not quite, the EPA has been around for 4 decades now, essentially. But that's 38,000 is a lot of wells. Part of what's been the challenge is those wells didn't anticipate the increase in volume of injection into them that the horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing revolution has caused. And so notably in Oklahoma, this is a former student and TA and teaching colleague, Emily, in this picture, and this is a topic she's done research on and is very interested in. This resulted, and Mark Zoback, who's an emeritus professor here in rock mechanics, was really the superhero, came in and figured out what was going on, because in Oklahoma, they were injecting into long-standing water disposal wells, but the rates of injection reached a point where it created pressure in a few of the wells that activated some deep faults. So just the rise in pressure of injection activated the faults. There was this rise in seismicity. He and his team, his grad students, understood it, helped inform the regulators in Oklahoma. They reduced how much could be injected in the wells that they could see were near these faults, and they raised the level of injection in the wells that weren't near the faults. And things have gone very smoothly since then. But managing all this is a part of the process of managing the brine, essentially, that comes up. Now with an EV revolution going on, there's become interest in what about this produced water? Are there metals, minerals, things that we can extract that are useful for some of the other things we're trying to do in decarbonization? So I think a lesson is that oil and gas are very related to water and water supply. There's a slide I think I'm going to get to that highlights the fact that when you look at the water, what daily withdrawals are, yes, this is 7 years old, and my colleague who's helping me update some slides, we just found some data to suggest that golf courses use about as much as livestock does around the country. You can see that hydraulic fracturing is using at least then. We need to see if we can get better data. But it's contextualizing, what do we use water for? We use water for lots of things. And most of the water being used, and Elaine, I want to check the New York Times article, at least the part of how, because under the social license to operate, most of the operators are creating a pedigree of where did the water come from that they're using for hydraulic fracturing. And the ratio that's repurposed water and non-potable water is much higher now than it was 5 years ago in the industry. So it's like so many other things around sustainability. If we can create transparency, measurement, certification, and differentiation, we're beginning to create point systems where companies can say, oh yeah, not only am I addressing my scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, but look at my water practices too. And so that area is just building out. So this is the contamination story, just making the point that those telescoping casings are supposed to prevent contamination, and the contamination issues we do have are largely a legacy issue. When you look at, it talked about it in the video, that about 0.5% to 1% are additives that go into water, basically, and then there's sand or artificial proppant that goes in. And now there's total disclosure, basically, in every state with oil and gas production about what is that 1% or 0.5%. In the beginning, when this kicked off, companies thought there was a secret sauce, and so they didn't share it, and it created fear. And everybody just shares it, and most people's secret sauce is about the same. The point of this slide is to make the argument that most of the things that are in there fall in the surfactant category. They're more like soap. They're there to help make things flow smoothly and to get the proppant into the fractures. But the more disclosure you can have and transparency on anything, the more comfortable communities are about what the risk and toxicity is relative to other things that are in the industrial system. So it's not perfect, but it's made a lot of progress in the last 10 years. So I mentioned disclosure. So there are rules and voluntary efforts in all the states that have any horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing going on. So this is just to give a geospatial aspect of that. So there's a lot of text on this slide, so I apologize for this, and we're going to talk about this topic more in the natural gas lecture. But an important concern of drilling and operating oil and gas wells is managing methane leakage. And we historically have had trouble doing this because we couldn't see it very well. And there's been a revolution in the infrared cameras and the ability to measure and detect methane and limit it, which we care deeply about because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, 20 times more potent in a 100-year period than CO2, and much more significant in the first 10 years, which is where natural gas is most present. So a lot of work is going on to evaluate this. The Natural Gas Initiative at Stanford with Adam Brandt and some of the other wonderful, Rob Jackson, some other folks here, their research teams are working on this closely, and there's information on the link on this slide. But the Permian Basin, which is really the #1 oil producing region in the United States, has as high as a 9% leakage rate, which is higher than the average, which is in the 2.7 to 3 range, and 3% leakage across the whole system really negates all the greenhouse gas benefits of burning gas instead of coal. There are other benefits besides the greenhouse gas benefits, meaning natural gas does not have solid waste like coal does, but managing methane leakage is really important to the viability of natural gas continuing as a valuable fuel, for enabling renewables by providing stability to the grid and things like that. If we have the leakage, those benefits are really less valuable. This slide is meant to highlight around the world what happens to natural gas that is associated with oil production. And you see in North America that almost 80% is sold and used commercially. But then on top of that, we have gas that's flared, gas that's used on site, and gas that is sold. So looking and seeing the mix of what happens on site. So I actually had that upside down, which is at the top, we have the vented or fugitive gas, and that is a big greenhouse gas problem. We have the flared gas of the kind of nice rich blue color there. And then the problem with flares, so at least it's better than not having them, but the efficacy or efficiency of those flares is not always as high as we would like. Then we have gas that's used on site to help manage operations, usually in the field, and then the gas which is sold. So part of our goal as a society, if we're producing gas, is to manage and limit how much is vented or fugitive and how much is flared, and to sell or use as much on site as is possible. So an environmental defense fund is cited as a reference here, and of all the national and global NGOs, EDF has a very deep team focusing and worrying for all of us, which is fantastic, on managing methane emissions. So this is circling back to the idea up at the upstream where we're drilling and producing, reminding us environmental impacts. What kinds of things do we have? So we have this really significant issue of abandoned and orphaned wellheads and other infrastructure. We have ongoing issues of our oil production, which is, one particular issue to call out is bird deaths associated with oil field production skim pits. But we have land use issues. We have some occasional spills. We have air pollution. We have methane leaks we've talked about. We have water consumption issues. We have waste. So how do we manage the produced water? How do we manage our mud pits, things like that? And just the habitat destruction associated with the sites, and how do we regulate and compel the restoration of these sites once they're no longer in commercial use. So there's a lot of text on this slide. In the course of me talking to you, I'm not going to read all these things, but we hope you'll take a few minutes to look at it. And I think something to call out is the range of the third bullet. The cost to plug and abandon a well can be as little as $6,000 to $10,000 or up to $400,000 for an onshore well. There are examples that are more expensive than that. An offshore well plugging and abandonment is much more expensive, as you would guess, given the marine circumstances. So I think something to highlight is certainly modern operators are required to file indemnity bonds, basically self-insuring against anything going on. And the slide highlights some of the legacy issues a little bit more. But this is an area that regulators are focusing on and have in the last 5 years in ways they hadn't at all in the past. So it's promising, and there will be incentives to address these legacy problems for current operators and for communities. But in a lot of ways, these represent big social costs that are being paid for, in many cases, with taxpayer dollars, rather than being paid for by the people that got the benefit of the oil and gas production in the past, both profiting from its production or the ability to use those hydrocarbons. So one of the points to make as well is that, as is often true, the legacy poop, if you will, of inactive mines and inactive wells in our country often correlates very closely with communities that are disadvantaged. And so it was just important to me to highlight this idea that legacy fossil issues correlate highly with disadvantaged communities. And in this particular case, it's highlighting areas in Los Angeles. So there's ongoing efforts by the industry and regulators to address environmental impacts. And the notes on this slide elaborate on some of those. So Stanford's Natural Gas Initiative, you see at the bottom, there are many efforts going on there that I encourage while you're here at Stanford to learn about and engage with. There are private companies. Renewwell, I've mentioned earlier, is repurposing abandoned or inactive wells. Project Canary is a methane management company that several Stanford folks are involved in. It was really hatched out of the Stanford environment. And the whole efficacy of the development of gray hydrogen versus blue hydrogen versus green hydrogen, and how do we certify that? And what are the impacts of all of those? That is something that the industry and regulators are really working on and building trust around these different categories. On the left-hand side, it highlights the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And how do we get to a place where we really believe that the net benefit of this kind of process highlighted on the left is the best solution societally for balancing it can lead to more oil production, but how and how can we measure and relate the carbon captured relative to the carbon that is getting released through the carbon capture process? So I'm not weighing in on this as an expert at all. I'm just saying these are all areas of active engagement with industry and with regulators and with NGOs as we try and manage our energy transition. This is an elaboration on one of those topics. In particular, Occidental Petroleum they have a whole group called Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. They recently acquired Carbon America and a DAC company, a direct air capture company. And they are working hard to try and get to a place of, as an oil and gas company, being carbon neutral by 2050. And so the whole certification of that is a very interesting new part of the oil and gas industry. So just to summarize kind of what's been going on in onshore drilling, completion, production, I think a key idea is things have been getting, if you look over the last 50 years, things have been getting more and more efficient, and they've been getting safer, both in terms of human risk, health risk, but also safer in terms of environmental impact, because the stewardship and the ability to provide transparency, measurement, certification, and differentiation between wells that represent good practices and wells that don't is building momentum right now. There's a ways to go, but we have been making a lot of progress. So we're drilling faster. We're going more horizontal. We have fewer wells and rigs needed, and we're increasing production. So there's a much higher level of efficiency. Things are becoming more standardized. The regulators and industry are actually working better together than they have in the past. And regulators are really digging in and saying, no, you can't drill or you can't do this until these other issues get addressed, which is great. We're shifting to the offshore. And you were assigned a video about the Perdido, the largest oil platform in the world. And for those of you that haven't read it yet, or watched it, excuse me, I encourage you to do so. But at the highest level, one of the things to think about this particular spar production facility platform is, imagine this, it's 200 miles off the coast of Galveston, Texas. It's operating in water depths of 2 miles, so almost 10,000 feet. And the borehole, the well bore, is almost 2 miles deep as well. So, that's 4 miles of depth from the ocean surface, $3 billion cost. It's really quite staggering to think about operations of this scale. And with that, I want to pivot to just thinking a little bit about the characteristics of offshore drilling and production. So some key ideas is it's challenging and it's expensive. You have to have very elaborate guidance systems, and blowout preventers have to be installed on the ocean floor, often in situations that are in either somewhere from 100 feet to 5,000 feet, sometimes more, underwater. sometimes like the Perdido, in situations where it's closer to 10,000 feet underwater. So the pressures you're dealing with and the forces, the physics of all that are really quite intense. In the US, offshore mineral rights are different than the onshore. There's no private mineral rights. We have state rights for the first 3 miles offshore and then federal rights after that. And then we get into international waters, which generally there's a limited amount of oil and gas development in international waters. That tends to be politically challenging to figure out how to manage that. And a couple of key places where that topic comes up is in the Northwest Passage, and then in the areas of the receding Arctic ice right now, but also in the South China Sea, where there's ambiguity and friction around who owns what. The return on offshore drilling is large, but the capital risk is super high. So I tend to think of it as these are elephant resource opportunities, but they're extremely capital intensive to go after. And then a key idea when we think about offshore drilling and production, because this slide is really meant to frame key ideas, is that there's a lot around what we've learned in offshore drilling and production that we can apply to offshore wind, which is really a new and important industry. Particularly in Europe and in parts of Asia, those parts of the world have moved to offshore wind faster than the United States has, largely due to constraints on land and the NIMBY and banana issues. So the ability to use some of the same service companies and expertise about navigating in the ocean environment are something that are being really leveraged for offshore wind right now. So I think the diagram at the left is just meant to give you a sense to really think about the scale of these offshore operations. So I want to highlight the fact that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the regulatory body for the United States for managing offshore oil and gas activity and lease sales and things like that, but also the organization stewarding offshore wind development and harvesting of battery minerals off the ocean floor, things like that. It's the regulatory body for energy development. Let's get a sense of the significance in the United States of offshore oil production. It's about 30% of all oil production globally, and it's less than that in the United States. In the United States, we're highlighting here the oil production versus the gas production in the United States, again, with the context that 30% of global production is happening in the offshore environment, really concentrated in about 5 countries. So how we drill in offshore, we use equipment like this, and the nature of the equipment we use, which you don't need to, get into in a lot of detail. The main point of this slide is we use different equipment in different water depths. And so you see the jackup rig in shallow water, the drilling barge in shallow water, the upper left and lower right. And then we have the drill ships or the semi-submersibles in deeper water. And then these are production platforms, not drilling. And so the Perdido is more like the spar that you see on the far right. And this is situations we alluded to in class where the facility that you see on the surface ends up becoming something that is staffed with hundreds of people who tend to have 2 half-day shifts. They're operating 24/7, 365. They come and go by helicopter or ship. In most of these, if not all of these facilities are anchored in some way, shape, or form, and with different roles of the anchoring and the floating aspects of the systems. So big variety of platforms, largely for different water depths and different marine stresses. So this slide is meant to highlight what have been the biggest drilling related accidents in the oil and gas industry, as opposed to production accidents. So on the drilling side, the biggest accident in terms of cost and damage is the Deepwater Horizon that happened relatively recently, 13 years ago. And the biggest accident in terms of human life is the Piper Alpha, which happened off the coast of Scotland. So very different geography, very different circumstances. and a list on the upper right of things that in this offshore environment, things that need, safety is very highly managed, but sometimes it's impossible to manage. And so there are issues seen here. What happened in the Deepwater Horizon is there were issues around the cementing, the quality of the cement job on the well, and blowout preventer failure. You can have unexpected drilling conditions. Sometimes you can have severe storms, and you can have a ship collide with your offshore facility. So there's an elaboration here. I went to UCSB as an undergraduate, and you see in the lower left highlighting the Union Oil platform that had a significant spill in 1969. So when I showed up at UCSB in 1980, that was still quite visceral in people's minds in the community, and a real hesitation to allow offshore drilling. In fact, after that spill in California in 1969, there was no drilling allowed in state waters, that 3-mile zone, for a decade or two after that period of time. And then a new set of regulation and trust was established to reactivate drilling in state waters after that. So it happens very rarely, but when it does happen, it's very expensive. $47 to $50 billion of damage and settlements in the case of the Deepwater Horizon. Really great expense associated with it. So here's a bit about the Macondo BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the biggest in world history. Just giving you some information on that, and a link to a video that we're not going to show in class, but we encourage you to take a look at. This is a well that was basically out of control for 104 days. The blowout preventer had issues, a pipe broke. They tried something called a static kill. Lots and lots of oil was leaked. There were, fortunately, only 11 people were killed, but any loss of life is really tragic. And lots of species impact of birds, sea turtles, marine mammals, etc. So a big catastrophic event, which again doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's something that requires, the settlement helped address some of this, but it requires a lot of regulatory and taxpayer response to clean up and address and deal with these situations. So it has reframed and reset further regulation for managing the offshore environment since this took place. This is another framing of U.S. oil spills. These are related not only to drilling, but to production. You see the Deepwater Horizon and its scale relative to other spills. And this shows where spills have been historically. I can at least report to you that the frequency of spills and the scale of spills has been declining overall if you pull the Deepwater Horizon out of the sample. And things have been relatively quiet on the spill side since the Deepwater Horizon. So another topic environmentally, when we think about the offshore environment, is thinking about how do we decommission these production facilities in the offshore environment. So there's more than 12,000 fixed oil and gas platforms in the seas worldwide, and they have a finite life. One of the things that's really interesting is they become essentially artificial reefs and very rich areas of biological activity. So it sometimes becomes complicated thinking about how best to decommission these. And in some cases, they plug and abandon the wells, and they basically cut the foundation of the platform and tip it into the ocean, because there is such a robust man-made reef of wildlife that has grown on the platform, that rather than removing it, they simply essentially permanently install it on the ocean floor. So, and obviously the bigger and deeper the platform, the more expensive it is to address in terms of decommissioning. But this whole idea of decommissioning onshore and offshore wells is becoming a robust area of stewardship, and oil and gas operators, needing to participate in this process and the regulatory enforcement to make sure we're doing this in the most thoughtful way. So to wrap up, we talked about the fact that the oil and gas have similar drilling processes. About a third of natural gas in the U.S. comes from associated natural gas. The drilling processes and the equipment we've talked about is very common to geothermal, and you'll see it associated with drilling wells for carbon capture and storage as well. There's been a lot of innovation around hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling so that we can drill far fewer wells and have much higher recoveries, and we can drill faster, and we can have things like drilled but uncompleted wells, so we can drill many wells from the same pad and bring them online and complete them when they're needed in the market. Regulatory oversight, at least in the United States, which is what we understand best, has really risen, and I think has been established to provide communities and with a comfort around the social license to operate, staffing, which is true in banking and medicine and many other fields that we regulate, properly staffing, motivating, training, and rewarding the regulators to enforce these regulations is an ongoing challenge. And I think encouraging public dialogue, which fortunately social media and other things raise issues quickly to the attention of regulators in manners that was hard to do before social media. Offshore drilling and production is a relatively small part of the story, but a very important one. And going back to the regulation and social reasons, I think this whole pathway of community-based development, and it includes addressing audiences of rural communities, Native American communities, finding a way to get communities to participate in discussions and to educate the communities where oil and gas drilling and completion and other energy activities are taking place is essential. Thank you so much.